3 billion birds gone. What does that mean? And what can we do about it? But before we get started with Doug, I wanted to say thank you to our sponsor and also give you just a couple of housekeeping items for you new to Zoom webinars. We want to start off by thanking our sponsor of this webinar and indeed all of our adult education speaker series, and that is the First Community Bank of Galena, Apple River State Bank. They've committed to 3 years of sponsoring these educational series for us, and so we're grateful for their generosity. Now just a couple of housekeeping items and Zoom pointers here. For those of you familiar with Zoom meetings, it's a little bit different. We won't be able to see you or hear you while you're on, but and that's for the entirety of the presentation. But you will be able to participate by asking questions throughout the presentation. And the way you do that is take your cursor and go down to the bottom of the screen you're looking at now. You'll see a little Q&A icon. And if you click on that icon, a little text box will come up. You can text your question into that box. We have screeners actually looking at those questions. And then we'll ask Doug some of your questions at the end of the presentation. Okay, now for introducing our expert speaker, PhD Doug Stotz. Doug was scheduled to be with us at our annual meeting in early April, but like everything else that happened around that time, the world kind of shut down on us and we had to cancel it. Doug is a senior ecologist at the Keller Science Action Center of the Field Museum. And after earning his bachelor's degree in biology at the University of Arizona, he went on to earn his PhD in evolutionary biology from the University of Chicago in 1990. Although he does a lot of research abroad, I've known Doug for his excellent work in studying bird migration in the Chicago area. He's a leading expert on the effects of climate change on bird populations, and he was quoted extensively in last year's really front page Chicago Tribune expose titled 3 Billion Birds Gone. So Doug, we're so thankful to have you here on our first live webinar. And on behalf of the participants and JDCF, we just want to thank you for being here with us, and I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you for having me here. So what I'm going to talk about is a study that came out last fall entitled 3 Billion Birds Lost, that was published in Science magazine, and it indicated that we had lost a huge number of birds over the last 50 years, and talked about what the patterns of that were. And they used, for this study, they used 3 data sets. The 3 data sets that they used were, next slide, I guess, the breeding bird surveys, which are 25-mile road surveys with 50 points, Christmas bird counts, which I imagine most of you have participated on, and then they used weather radar. Weather radar picks up bird migration, and from it they could estimate how much bird migration has changed over the last couple of decades. Next slide. So the breeding bird surveys there are about 2,900 routes that are run all over North America. I shouldn't say all over North America, all over the United States, and then mostly southern Canada. You can see there's very little in the northern part of Canada. But it gets very good coverage across the lower 48. Next slide. And then Christmas bird counts look fairly similar. 2 years ago, there were 2,420 counts run just in the US and Canada. And you can see the distribution looks very similar to the breeding bird surveys, where it's pretty thick, but is fairly limited in northern Canada. Next slide. And so in part to deal with the fact that northern Canada wasn't covered, which has a lot of boreal forests where a lot of birds breed, they looked at weather radar. And so this is a spring night from 2019. And each of those circles, those blue circles, are actually birds. You can see like up near Lake Superior, there are some green blobs. That's weather. But birds show up on there, and the intensity of bird migration, you can tell by the colors and how widespread the birds are in there. And so this is a fairly intense night of migration. Next slide. Okay, overall what they found was that 419 species, so they looked at about 520 species, 419 were showing declines that totaled nearly 3 billion birds. There were about 100 species showing increases totaling about 26 million. So much bigger declines than increases in the species that were changing. Next slide. So the most common bird in the study was American robin. And on a lot of these slides going forward, you'll see numbers. And that number plus 0.1 means that American robin over the last 50 years has increased about 0.1% a year. So that's going to end up being about a 10% increase across that time period. On the right is dovekie, which is the least common bird in the study, although there is a much bigger population in the old world. And dovekie is declining at the rate of about 1% per year. And that adds up across 50 years to about a 60% decline. And American robin, 336 million, dovekie, 1,500. Next slide. To estimate these populations, they used the breeding bird for most species that they had good breeding bird survey data. They used the abundance on those breeding bird surveys and the range shown by the breeding bird survey, and then used detailed vegetation and land use mapping to then estimate their abundance in different vegetation types, and then add it all up across the entire country. And this is a fairly complicated thing. The map that I show of vegetation on the right is much less detailed than what they were using, but you can see the basic idea. You might notice that for American robin here in northern Illinois, we're in the heart of its most abundant place. But one thing that's really noticeable about robins is they're all over the place. They kind of disappear as you get into the very south, but they're very widespread, plus being very common. Next slide. Okay, if you look at the data from this, you can estimate the population declines for each individual species. And this list of 10 species are the species that show the biggest numeric declines overall. And so you have a couple of blackbirds, you have a couple of introduced species, you have some grassland birds like hornlark and savanna sparrow, and some northern forest birds like black-polled warbler, dark-eyed junco, pine siskin, and white-throated sparrow. So there's a number of different things here. One of the things I would point out is these 10 species combined account for about half of the total loss of birds. So that 3 billion birds lost is mostly about declines in common birds. Next slide. Okay, if we can use breeding bird survey trend maps to see the geographic pattern of how these changes are happening. And basically on these maps, if it's red, the bird is declining in that area. If it's blue, it's increasing. And so common grackle is decreasing over most of the eastern US. If you get out into the Great Plains, they're increasing, but that's an area where they weren't historically very common. So that increase doesn't mean a lot of more birds. The decreases in the east where they're most common means a lot bigger decline. Hornlark, which is a grassland species, is decreasing over most of its range. In particular, the Great Plains, where its biggest populations are, has lost a lot. And then house sparrow, which is an introduced species, you can see is declining more or less everywhere. Those three species, the declines that we're seeing there mostly relate to agricultural practices. These are birds that were common in agricultural areas, still are common in agricultural areas, but have declined a lot as agriculture has become more more intensive over the last few decades. And then finally, dark-eyed junco is a boreal forest bird. It also occurs in the forests of the western US. And you can see, again, declines over much of its range. But this is a species where it extends north out of the area that is covered by the breeding bird survey. And so for a bird like this, they have to do some estimation based on the weather radar data and just assuming that patterns look the same where we don't really have data. Next slide. So what groups are declining? Grassland birds are probably the biggest group. And an example of a grassland bird showing decline is eastern meadowlark, which is declining 3.3% per year, and overall has lost about 75% of its population over the last 50 years. Eastern meadowlark is a species, is one of the grassland species that used to do very well in agricultural lands, not just protected grasslands, but that's where the big declines are happening there. Forest birds as a whole have lost a huge number. About 1 billion forest birds have been lost. An example of this is wood thrush, a common breeder still in Illinois, but it's a bird that's declining in Illinois and in much of its range, and it's gone down 2.1% per year. A lot of introduced birds show declines, and house sparrow is perhaps the best example of that. It used to be very common in agricultural lands, but as agriculture has changed how animals are part of the system and has become more intensive and neater, there just isn't as much food for house sparrows. And then shorebirds as a group are among the biggest declining ones. And the bird that's shown there is red knot, which is now considered an endangered species. Its population in North America has declined, it looks like between 3 to 4% per year. This is one of the species that, because it breeds in the Arctic and winters in South America, our ability to get really firm numbers on it is not that great. But they do concentrate during migration, and those migration concentrations have declined dramatically. Next slide. There are species that are increasing, and I think you're probably aware of some of these, especially you all up in northwestern Illinois. Bald eagle has increased dramatically since its low point back in the 60s, and that's primarily tied into the discontinuation of DDT, but also the general trend to not treating raptors as enemy predators that should be controlled. We also see good increases in blanked out. Cooper's hawk, there we go. And Cooper's hawk, historically was called chicken hawk and was considered a pest in farm country. So they were treated, shot often, and that has really changed the sort of our view of raptors. The other thing with Cooper's hawk is they respond well to habitat restoration. They like the open woodlands that we create with habitat restoration. Waterfowl are generally doing well because of groups like Ducks Unlimited and the concentration on wetland habitats by the Fish and Wildlife Service and things like national wildlife refuges. White-fronted goose, which is there, is a bird that has increased dramatically. Again, it's an Arctic breeder, and I couldn't find a reasonable estimate of how much they've increased, but they've obviously increased quite a bit. Gadwall, which is a prairie pothole breeder, has increased on average 2.7% per year. And waterfowl in general have done very well over the last few decades as management has improved the habitats that they like. Sort of going along with the waterfowl has been some other wetland species that are also increasing, and sandhill crane is an example of that. Sandhill crane in Illinois, of course, became extinct as a breeder, and it now breeds fairly widely in northern Illinois, but it's increased dramatically throughout its range. Next slide. So where do we go from here? One of the things is, how do we respond to the current threats? And there are a variety of threats. The two big ones, I think, are habitat loss, as it always is, and then environmental toxins. So this is primarily agricultural chemicals, both insecticides and herbicides, that have become more heavily used in agricultural settings. There's a new threat on the horizon, climate change, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So let's go to the next slide. There's a place online called 3billionbirds.org where they have a series of actions people can take to bring birds back. One of those things is avoiding pesticides, and that means buy organic as much as you can. Don't use pesticides around your house. There's no question that both insecticides and herbicides have negative impacts on the birds that are in agricultural lands and in urban and suburban landscapes as well. Reducing plastic pollution is an important factor for a number of species. I'm sure you've seen the stories in newspapers about how plastic is pervasive, and a number of species can die from ingesting plastic. Reducing lawns is an important thing, planting natives in your yard. This relates to how important cities can actually be for biodiversity. Nature does need cities as much as we think nature is something that happens outside of the cities. Making windows safer. This is more of an issue in a big city like Chicago than it is going to be in your smaller towns, but even your house, your windows will kill birds. And so there are a variety of things you can do to make those windows less of bird killers. One of the big things is turning off lights at night, because the birds get attracted to the lights at night. Keeping cats indoors. Cats kill billions of birds every year, and part of that is a feral population that we haven't come to terms with. But your own house cat, even though you feed it regularly, if it goes outside, it will kill birds. A lot of our birds winter in the neotropics, in the tropical zones of Central and South America, where coffee plantations, if they are low pesticide and have a canopy of native trees over them, they can be very good for birds. On the other hand, some of the big brands grow what's called sun coffee, where there isn't the tree canopy, and there's very little habitat for the birds in those areas. And huge areas of Central and South America are in coffee. And then finally, they suggest bird watching is an important thing you can do, and that seems like an easy one to do. But contributing to monitoring programs that are out there, because getting this information helps us know what's going on, and that will help us devise the appropriate activities in order to help keep birds on the landscape. Next slide. One thing that is missing from that list is fighting habitat loss. And I think that's in part because it's not an individual action, it's more a group action. But a group like your group working in Joe Daviess County has protected a lot of habitat. And what we're looking for is to make it so as much of the habitat as possible looks like the bottom with wetlands and diverse forest, rather than like the top with corn and suburban sprawl. So the work we do to protect habitats and to expand habitats is really crucial to holding on to the birds we have. Next slide. So what about climate change? It's interesting that at almost the exact same time as this study came out, National Audubon produced a study on climate change that made a lot of attention. In that study, they estimated 389 species were at risk from climate change. And the thing I would say about climate change is it's a threat intensifier. It's not so much climate change by itself puts species at risk, but species that are already under pressure, the additional pressure from climate change can make a huge difference to them. Next slide. And in Illinois, the idea is by the end of this century, the conditions in terms of summer weather will be like East Texas. So you can imagine that means the birds that breed here currently may have trouble handling those temperatures, and we might see declines in them. Next slide. But one of the things when we talk about climate change, people tend to focus on the direct effects, hotter temperatures, more precipitation, increased intensity of storms, and those can be important, but much more important are the indirect effects, how those changes affect things like the prey they're able to find, the predators that are there, and the diseases that the plants have to do, how it changes the habitats that are in there, and also the timing of when things happen in the annual cycle. So when things leaf out in the spring, when flowers are available, when fruit becomes available, when there are big flushes of insects, all those things are changing their timing, and birds have trouble responding to that in part because they tend to use photo periods. So how long the day is to tell them when to do things. And if things are changing in response to climate, they may not be able to follow that very well. Next slide. So I want to focus on one species, bobolink, grassland species. It's declining at 2.1% per year. In Illinois, the state population estimate is that we've lost 95% of them. And the breeding bird survey shows a nearly 7% annual decline in Illinois. So it's doing very poorly here. Its preferred nesting habitat was hayfields, okay? A couple of things have happened. One is hayfields have become much less common, but secondly, the hayfields that exist are now an ecological trap. The bobolinks come in spring, start nesting in the hayfields, but because of the intensification of agriculture and to some degree because of climate change already, the first harvest is so early they don't successfully nest in hayfields. So bobolink is becoming a species that is found and as an effective breeder only in protected areas. It has an additional problem. It winters in southeastern South America. So this is southern Brazil, northeastern Argentina, and they're considered a pest in the rice fields down there. So they get shot and poisoned and that sort of thing. So they have an issue on the winter part of their range too. Next slide. So with respect to climate change, one of the things you see, this is actually an earlier version of the Audubon study. And at the top is the current range of bobolink. The middle is turning that into a model of where bobolink occurs. And then the bottom is what we expect bobolink's range to be if climate change continues unabated. And you can see, although currently they're in northern Illinois, they will be gone from Illinois. They'll almost be gone from Wisconsin. And the main area that has bobolinks are up in Ontario and Quebec, in areas that currently are all forest. So the idea that bobolinks will be able to follow climate change, I think, is probably not true because there isn't going to be the habitat for them in these new areas. So next slide. So what do we do about bobolink? Is it doomed? And I think the answer to that is no, it's not doomed. Next slide. But maintaining is going to be tricky. It's going to require large grasslands. It's going to require protected lands. Those are really crucial because the current agricultural system just isn't appropriate for us. They like it moist and thick, And because we're expected to get rainier, that may not be an issue here. And I think the main strategy is to extend the populations where they currently exist and not look to bring bobolinks into new areas. But bobolink is a species that's really going to be affected by climate change, but it's already been affected by the changes that we see in agriculture. So this points out the importance of climate change as a threat intensifier. We need to remember that birds are a best case scenario in terms of them because they can move in response to it. Most other things can't. But it will be worse than what the models are suggesting because not everything will be responding in the same way. And the timing mismatches, I think, are a big issue for them. Next slide. So what do we do about climate change and effect on natural environment? We need to reduce carbon input. That's the most important thing. Anything we can do to reduce stresses on natural environments be crucial. We need to allow organisms to move. So that means creating habitat corridors and increasing the phenological diversity of spring leaf out because things are being pushed in one direction in terms of leaf out. So to the degree that we can create large interconnected landscapes of quality habitat, the better off we are. And it's probably too late for northeastern Illinois, but up in northwestern Illinois where you all are, there's still that opportunity. Next slide. And part of it is what do we do personally? Reducing carbon use for transportation. The pandemic's been good for me. I'm doing a lot less driving, so that's probably a good thing. Eating less meat is an important thing because much of the industrial agriculture we have is about raising beef. So the corn and soybeans that are being raised are mostly about feeding cattle, and it's a lot more effective not to do that. I should say I'm not a vegetarian. I haven't given up meat, but I do eat less. And the other thing is we need to vote for candidates that really take it clearly. At the governmental level, something like the Green New Deal, maybe not exactly that, but something of that sort will be necessary. And then something like a carbon tax to require payments for the harm due to carbon. Next slide. So this final slide is a set of migratory species. So these are all migrants to Central and South America. So they're neotropical migrants that are declining. These are primarily woodland species. The upper left, blue-winged warbler, is a shrubland species. Veery in the middle is breeds locally in northern Illinois, but is declining over most of its range. Rose-breasted grosbeak at the upper right is a species that we expect to lose to climate change in the near future, and it's a species that really needs big areas of woodland to survive. At the left is black-billed cuckoo, which is a declining species that's been listed as threatened in Illinois because of how much it has declined. At the bottom is golden-winged warbler, and I noticed that there's no number on that one, but I think it's around 3% per year. This is a species that's being considered for listing federally. It used to breed in Illinois, but no longer does, in part because of pressure from blue-winged warbler, in part because of changing climate. In the middle is Canada warbler, which breeds just north of us and then winters in South America in the Andes. And then to the right center is scarlet tanager, which is a large woodland species. And then finally at the bottom right is indigo bunting, which is sort of an edge species, but still is declining throughout much of its range. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for your presentation. There's a lot to hold on there to digest in that, but a couple of questions that have come through the group. One of them is, your early slides talk a lot about or are drawing data from information that's gathered from citizen scientists, really, through bird counts, Christmas counts, breeding bird surveys, those kinds of things. which are a lot of boots on the ground people, like, average people who really care about birds. Are you seeing, so that's a great data set.
Yeah.
And I know some of the scientists are now drawing and looking more at the crowdsourcing platforms through apps, in particular, iNaturalist and eBird. Are you starting to see, what's the Field Museum, what are you doing? What are other scientists doing on those platforms, and how important are those as we move forward and use more of this technology?
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question. The eBird is, just an incredible source of data. It's a huge amount of data being used by millions of birders. The weakness with eBird, and this is so breeding bird survey, one of the things that makes it sort of the gold standard is it has a very detailed methodology. The points that are done, it's the same point year after year after year. You spend 3 minutes there. If you hear something before you start and you hear something after the 3 minutes, those don't count. It's in those 3 minutes. And so statistically, it's very easy to work with. The Christmas bird count is much less strong methodology, but it has a long history of people covering the same areas. And for common things, the kind of fact that you're relying on a really variable population in terms of how good they are and how they cover the land can be less of an issue. eBird you get farther off into that, where you've got a lot more variation in the quality of the data collection. When I go out birding, I'm not, and this is an issue. I mean, even with the breeding bird survey, there is an issue with the fact that two different observers are not the same. But the breeding bird survey, because of its good methodology, can actually estimate what those differences are. If you look at eBird and I go to, Joe Daviess County and bird in one of your preserves, how do I compare to you birding that same preserve the next day? Are those differences do that? And so there are limits to what you can do with eBird. On the other hand, the amount of data there is enormous. Oh. And for some things that will work really well. And so I think especially like these common birds we're seeing declines in, eBird is a good place to pick that up. Where it's probably less of an issue, where it's less good, are things that are relatively rare and where the changes are fairly small. So there's a lot to be gained from them, but there are limits. In terms of iNaturalist, from a bird perspective, it just doesn't compare to eBird. The thing it has going for it is it covers all sorts of organisms. So, what I'd say is, like, if you want to look at what's happening in one of your grassland preserves, you'd use eBird to look at the bird data there, but you could use iNaturalist to look at other groups to see what's happening.
Yeah. Well, we're looking at, we have a very robust citizen scientist, especially in the bird monitoring, whether it's a really good long-standing bluebird monitoring program, or very organized Christmas counts and spring bird counts through Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation, going on 30 years now. So we have a lot of people who care about birds, and that gets to the second question, and that had to do with grasslands. It seems like there's an opportunity to work with the agricultural community on giving those grassland species, Henslow sparrows, bobolink, meadowlark, an opportunity to at least get through their first clutch of eggs and get those birds, through into dispersing from the nesting area and flying. What are you aware of any programs that we should be looking at to work with farmers in this area? There's a lot of hayfield because of the topography in this area here. So there's a lot more hay here than there might be in the rest of Illinois. What can we be doing with the farm community?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question that I don't fully know the answer to. It would, I mean, I think there are farm programs that can be brought into play. I mean, one of the things like Henslow's sparrow is a species that was considered threatened in Illinois and is now been taken off of threatened use and has increased dramatically. Part of that is how we manage our protected areas, but another big part of it is the CREP program, CRP, and they're major populations of Henslow's sparrows in CRP land, and that's made a huge difference. For something like, the issue with hayfields is it's a tricky one. At Medewin National Grassland near Chicago, when it was formed, there were all these agricultural leases there, and a lot of hay was being grown, but they were having the issue with it being harvested too early. So they changed it so that you couldn't harvest until, I can't remember what the date was, but later in the season, so that bobolinks could get off their young before that. And what happened was most of the farmers switched it over to soybeans. Unintended consequences of that attempt. So, I mean, it's to be fair, farmers need to make a living off of their land, and so we need to think about what are ways to make it economically viable for them to do those sorts of things. And there are a lot of farmers that do a great job, and I know, one of the things I've been working on besides birds has been monarchs, and the agricultural sector is another big issue there. And the basically switch to Roundup ready crops has devastated the agricultural populations there. But at the same time, the farmers are doing programs in land that isn't their main cropland, and that's a big part of it. And I think that's something that we probably have to look at for grassland birds.
We've one of our preserves, Valley of Eden Bird Sanctuary, I know you're familiar with that because it just got designated as an important bird area primarily for Henslow sparrows, but has a robust population of bobolink and meadowlarks as well. So, and that is partly being grazed. It provides a variety of habitat there. So we're learning from those farmers, and hopefully can get more farmers on board with that mix that you're talking about. A couple of other questions. Baltimore Orioles, Northern Orioles, Baltimore when I was a kid, then Northern, now back to Baltimore. A lot of people are seeing more of them this year. Randy Downing asks, is that a species that you're aware of is going up, or are we just seeing kind of more of them around our homes? What's the status of the Baltimore Oriole?
Baltimore Oriole is basically stable in terms of population, and I think a lot of people have commented on how much more they saw of them. I actually think that's probably a reflection of the fact we had a late spring. So because the woods were behind when the Orioles got here, they were looking for places where they could feed, and so feeders.
And they're easier to see without all the foliage, too.
Right, and they are easier to see without all the foliage, but they come into people's yards for feeders. And the other thing is that a lot of the ornamentals that you plant in your yard are earlier phenologically than the woods are. And so if the woods are really delayed, then the greenery that's around may be mostly in people's yards. So
I think it might be a increase in grape jelly use in the area too.
Well, there's that too. We put out a Oriole feeder for the first time this year. It's like within an hour we had a Oriole.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Two more quick questions, and I think we'll wrap it up. One was, are these slides available? Or can you share these? Can we use this in the future? What's your thought?
Yeah. I mean, I think this has been recorded, but
Yeah,
and you all have the slides, so
yeah,
that's
okay.
that's fine.
Just wanted to make sure. And then the last question, and I kind of didn't, I'm going to ask it, but I'm not sure I understand. It says the bobolink had an increase in population in 57. I think maybe that's 1957, but I'm not sure. Why an increase in 57? Does that make sense to you? I want to make sure I'm
Uh, oh, I know what he's talking about. It was that I
okay.
gave data between the 1900 and then the next set was 1957 and then current. And
Got it.
we
Okay.
went up between 1900 and 1950s and then declined dramatically. And essentially what that was about was the clearing of woodland for agricultural purposes, so that there was a big increase in open land compared to what was here originally. Um, as and at that time, agriculture was pretty usable by bobolinks. The big decline since 1957 is mostly about the fact that the agricultural land has become basically not appropriate for bobolinks. It's
Yeah, and I would imagine there was a lot more hay going on then, more diverse farming, and now it's more, row cropping.
yeah,
World
right.
War.
And that's um, there was a book, I can't remember the title, it's something like 100 Years of Change
Yeah,
by people at the Natural History Survey, where they looked at these data sets and recreated the data set that was done in 1900. It, you should read how they did bird surveying in 1900. It's really pretty different from how we do it today. And then 1950s was the Grabers who worked at the um, down there in Champaign, and then recently. And one of the things they look at is the change in what crops are there, and so things like hay disappeared, small grains disappeared,
yeah,
corn went up, but corn's always been a big player. The big shift was soy. Soy was essentially a non-factor until the 1960s,
yeah,
and now is battles with corn for
yeah.
most of it.
Number of acres.
Yeah,
Well, Doug, I want to thank you on behalf of JDCF and all the people on this live webinar for the work that you're doing at the Field Museum, that your colleagues are doing. We are so honored to have this collaboration with the Field Museum across different disciplines there, anthropology,
right.
insects, and you with birds. We feel fortunate and lucky to have this kind of connection with this institution. So we hope we'll be in touch again with you, and we hope to bring you out here live in the
Yeah,
future.
love to be out there.
I know you and your wife like to get out here once or twice a year. So hopefully we'll be able to connect and do some birding together and maybe have you speak again in the future. But we are grateful for having such a great scientific institution to be working with, and the work that you're doing really helps us understand what we can do better as conservationists and citizens. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Our next live webinar will be coming up this midsummer. We don't have an exact date yet, but we'll have local professor and historian Daryl Watson with us. He's going to be talking about the Apple River Canyon State Park and how that's developed since the 1920s up until our most recent acquisition, 330 acres, just a few months ago. We bought in between two a gap in between two units of the state park there. And Daryl's family grew up in that area, so he knows the story there really well, has some really interesting photographs and documents. And he'll be talking about this incredible resource that we have in Northwest Illinois. I think one of the most beautiful, scenic, geological, important areas, ecologically important areas in Northwest Illinois, the Apple River Canyon area. So stay tuned for that. We want to thank again our sponsor, First Community Bank of Galena, Apple River State Bank. We want to thank the members, our volunteers from the Conservation Outreach Committee for their behind the scenes work. There are a whole bunch of people doing things on their computers to make this happen. Thank the JDCF education and communication staff. And we want to thank you for being present with us today and for the support that you give this organization and the conservation community that you've built here. So until we see you again, thanks for joining us. So long.